Hello teachers, I'm Becky Olson. Today we're talking about Lesson 170, Finding Gospel Truths in the Scriptures. Okay, in the lesson, when you get to this beginning activity, this is a video called The Parable of the Gems. Notice that there's just a little 2-minute clip from this almost 7-minute video. Just show only that 2-minute clip. If you don't have access to this video, I've taken it and pulled out the transcription of the audio for those 2 minutes. And I put that on a PDF and you'll find that in the video description. That's really important to just have that so that you can either read it as a story or you can show the video. Before you show that, I would just talk with the students and tell them that different parts of this young woman's dream represent elements of learning from the scriptures. So they can try to think of ways that the different elements of the dream connect to their personal scripture study or how to make their personal scripture study more meaningful. There's a copy in the video description of these different elements that you want them to look for. Let me pull this over and show you. These are the different elements that you want them to watch for or listen for. When you get done either reading the story to them or having them watch the video, then you can have them turn to each other and do a pair and share. It's also called turn and talk, where they take with a partner and they talk about those different elements and think about what those different elements could represent. After they've shared with a partner for a few minutes, you can then open it up to a full class discussion about what they learned about making their personal scripture study more meaningful. And then at that point, you would jump back into the lesson at this paragraph here, where you're talking about doctrines and principles of the gospel can be like the gems in that dream. Now, make sure that as you are talking about this, that you say this is one of the ways to kind of interpret that dream, or one of the ways that the elements of the dream could be represented is doctrine and principles of the gospel. But make sure that you don't dismiss their ideas, because they might come up with other things that those gems could represent, and you don't want them to feel like they just have to come up with the exact thing you're thinking in your mind, or that little guessing game, guess what the teacher is thinking, is not fun for the students. So accept their answers and add that this is another way that that dream could be interpreted. Now, if you're teaching on Zoom, you would handle this opening activity very similarly, where you would either show the video or you would read the story, and you can share that document, the PDF document with the elements. You can share that in the chat. You can share a link to it, or you can upload the file as a document in the chat so that the students can take a look at those elements. Give them a minute to think about it, and then have everybody drop in the chat the things that they think those elements could stand for. And as you start reading through their responses and just have them pull it in, sometimes I like to call it waterfall, where you just add as many elements as you can to the chat. Then you can call out specific responses and ask follow-up questions to those students. And you could even say things like, oh, hey, that is such an interesting idea. I hadn't thought of that before. Would you describe it a little bit more? Or you could say, wow, that's a new way of thinking about it. Tell us a little bit more about your thought process with that. And this way you can use the chat to encourage more classroom discussion. Okay, once you've finished your opening activity, you're going to get into the part of the lesson that's the meat of the lesson. This is where you're helping your students learn how to identify those doctrine and principles. We want them to be able to remember those principles so they can start using it on their own at home. And in order to help them learn that, I thought it would be nice to help them memorize these principles and think about them a little bit more deeply during the lesson. In the handout, and you can just print that. There's a link in the lesson for that PDF. But in the handout, it numbers these different ways to identify principles. It says 5, but I'm counting each of these A, B, C, D as their own idea. And I have a couple of slides that you can use with this section that I'm going to put with the other lesson slides. And here is an example of the slide that you could include in your lesson slides. You could show this slide and just tell the students you're going to give them 30 seconds to memorize these pictures. So put on a timer, actually only give them 30 seconds so that there's a sense of urgency, and then go to the next slide and find out if they can remember all 8 images. And as a group, they might be able to do it, but you could also see if individual students could remember them. Have a little bit of a little competition to see who can remember the most number of the images. And then you can go to this slide and talk about what each of those images represents, and that it's one way that they can identify doctrine and principles in the scriptures. This would be a good time to hand out that the PDF handout that's in the lesson and have them follow along. And that the snail is a symbol of reading slowly and carefully. Flag is these flag phrases that are clearly stated truths where it's called out for us, like the therefore or and thus we see, where the principle is already identified for us. The dictionary and thesaurus is looking for implied truths. The first one, which was A, important ideas, words, or phrases. Then we've got a mousetrap for cause and effect, point of a needle for the moral or the point of the story, an author for looking for the author's intent, a highlighter for them to mark their scriptures, and a mirror to ponder why the truth is important to you. So these are ways that they could memorize these different strategies. Just 2 more things I want to point out. If you scroll all the way down to supplemental learning activities, there's this activity about clearly stated principles. This is all about those flag phrases. So this is a really nice activity if you wanted to emphasize that particular strategy. The next thing is this part, other tools to help students identify truths. It calls out this thing about the Doctrine and Covenants, how a lot of times those revelations were in response to a specific question or a problem that the saints were facing. So understanding that problem or that question helps us to understand the Doctrine and Covenants. So that is something, because we're studying Doctrine and Covenants this year, this is something that would be really important to point out to our students. Okay, that's it for this week. I hope that through this lesson, your students will gain greater confidence in identifying doctrines and principles in the scriptures. Have a great week.